the title of the session, so really what I'm going to do today, and I'll introduce myself in a second, kind of as part of why I'm be doing this talk, but for those of you familiar with OpenTelemetry, hands raised, using it today or thinking about it? Yeah, okay. So I'm going to be talking about a little bit about just the space of observability and like cost of downtime, what we see in financial services, and that's largely the report that our marketing team did with the Oxford Economics research. We'll go through that. I'm going to talk a bit about what we see with OpenTelemetry financial services. My background is I started my career at Bloomberg way back right before the financial crisis. I ended up transitioning into observability by working for Gartner and covering the observability space. A big part of why was when I was at Bloomberg, even though I sold the Bloomberg terminal. I actually had more fun talking to our developers and engineers about how they manage the back end. And one of my favorite things to pitch when I go on site is, hey, Bloomberg's got the second largest private IT in the world. And I was fascinated. I had a friend I played hockey with who he was on part of the back end team and dealt with a lot of challenges. So I kind of got really into that and then eventually made my way to actually working for some of the vendors. And now I've been working for Splunk for the past 6 years. And OpenTelemetry, we've seen in the past, say, 4 years, and just when I went GA in the last 2 years alone, the traction we're seeing is like pretty tremendous. I've had the good fortune of working on a lot of Splunk's larger financial services customers, and I've been on about 200 different meetings over the past 3 years with different accounts. I've got to see a lot of what people are doing, what they're not doing, and some of the confusion that's still out there. And usually when we talk to a CTO, they'll say, oh, I've heard about this OpenTelemetry thing, and yeah, it's for this cloud data stuff over here, or hey, we use it over there. And then we've got large financials that are using OpenTelemetry across the board, from actually infrastructure monitoring in air-gap VM environments, which you tell that to someone else, and they're like, I didn't know that was possible. In any event, so as I mentioned, we're going to quickly go through that report I was talking about. I'll give you a quick overview of OpenTelemetry, just kind of, if everyone's familiar with it, I'll just kind of do the highlights. And then a bit about specifically how the different data standards and what that means from a holistic observability practice around cost and actually cost control. I'll talk a bit about what some of the vendors are doing, and we're not the Splunk's not the only ones. There's a bunch of vendors that are doing everything like holistic, from bringing the data to use OpenTelemetry as pipelines, which you can also use end-to-end data transforms from the actual vendors themselves. It's a big area that we're focusing on, as well as different things we do within the solutions to drop data. But the goal is not, this is not going to be like a vendor pitch. I really just want to conceptually help you understand the totality within the vendor space. And then lastly, some takeaways and next steps. So the survey I mentioned, done with Oxford Economics. It's done with about 2,000 people. For those of you, if you've worked for a vendor before, a lot of times we'll sponsor these surveys, but we have like a company like Oxford do the whole thing. And so they surveyed 2,000 people. The main issues they find financial services institutions are facing, and these are not surprising, partly to me because I spend my day life in this, but for the most part, number one is determining the actual root cause of downtime. And for instance, last year, working with a large financial services company, and they had an issue that they didn't discover for 4 days. Took down 75 services. It started with one simple API change. And the irony is we're all sitting there, we're like, this is preventable. But it was something that they just hadn't configured the right alert or what have you, and finding the actual root cause or where the stack was a 4-day effort, which is kind of fascinating. And it seems to be the case across most financial services. The other is addressing the actual downtime. So even once they like in the case of this company or another company we worked with recently, they're like, it's not necessarily, like once we find the problem, it's then like, well, it's a whodunit game, or why, or what's the actual configuration change of this or that. And then lastly is a lot of organizations, and I think working for a vendor, I feel bad for our customers, because I think vendors make it almost worse, because there's a lot of marketing, a lot of BS out there. But so many companies know that, hey, like we need to make changes, or we want to make changes. And we had a customer recently, and he said, we've got like 14 different tools, and I go to your websites, and you all say you do the same thing. And I was like, yeah. And he's like, but we are the last to find out about issues, and we're on a burning platform. And the irony is I knew I'd seen them in the news, and I knew that their platform, I actually tried to do some
my wife and I were trying to do something with a service that they offered, and so it's kind of like I knew it, but the reality is it's hard, right? Reliability and everything especially has gotten really challenging. Some interesting points here. So human error is being tagged as like the actual, like the largest source of why downtime is even happening. And that's partly because of tool fragmentation, misconfigurations, or we had a customer one time where they had storage bins on AWS that just weren't being flagged and weren't being monitored, and they had their largest customer call in, and it was like several days later. And so simple things like just not having things implemented correctly. I don't like that they call it human error because I don't quite see it as human error. I think it's like we're all awash in tools and data and are trying to live our lives. So I wish if I were them, I would have changed how they talk about it, but it really should be it's human error as a result of just the challenging environments that people are working in. And then another thing too around like, so the SaaS third-party applications is interesting because a lot of times it used to be, especially when we were at Gartner, we used to talk about this where, you know, you're going with the SaaS offering because you're not like, they're supposed to manage and maintain it for you. But we've seen a lot of incidents where there was the incident a couple years ago with on the AWS, the DNS, where like you could have just been monitoring, you know, certain AWS things that normally you wouldn't expect to, right? And so it's interesting to see that does tend to be a big, at least contribute to root cause in this situation. Some general guidance, and this is like feedback that so there's something like only 30% of companies actually have a downtime plan or like a process in place. And I've seen real time talking to a lot of customers where they're like, oh yeah, we had this incident, like we had no idea what to do. Like everyone's on a war room, everyone's on a bridge, bring them all in. And there are some different best practices. There's some folks here too who are also speaking around OpenTelemetry and other things where they've actually got books and everything that talk about best practices for what to do or what sort of plans to have in place. And then postmortems, surprisingly, another one, it's only like 40% are actually doing postmortems or even know how to do postmortems or why you would do them. And so we do see a lot of customers where like the same incidents will happen, you know, time and time again. Another way to address downtime is that, okay, and actually I think they messed up these slides a bit, but basically should have been on the last slide that like the mean time to actually detect problems is around 18 hours. So I mentioned the example before where it's like 4 days. I get the data shows 18 hours, but based on what I've seen over the years, like sometimes I would say it's probably multiple days where this might be a little bit lower, but let's go with it. And one of the piece of advice is keep calm and protect your company IP. I guess in the survey they heard a lot of people saying, well, now that there's these, if you've got different vendors you use, they have generative AI capabilities within the tool. And like that actually is going to help you make life easier. And you know, the idea is like you're better off, you know, keeping calm when incidents happen and use the tools you have, you know, to your betterment. Whether or not I agree with the Gen AI thing, I don't know. I don't know if anyone else feels the fact that generative AI it's promising, but in terms of the observability tooling space, I'm still waiting to see all of those vendors actually deliver in a better way. And then lastly, take a proactive approach. And this I feel like goes hand in hand again. I think they gave me these slides and I think they messed up on, they should have been consolidated. So the third one, this is my favorite thing to talk about here. So we saw before that cost of downtime is around $150 million on average annually. Interestingly, they find that financial services organizations spend less typically than other industries to the tune of 30 million versus 43 million. I don't know if part of that is because of, I find financial services dabbles more in open source world, right? And that's where we're here today. I don't know if that was contributed, but it is an interesting statistic and thought, because I have seen, and I've heard from customers in different organizations feel like there's not enough spending done on observability in general, but especially in financial services. But the main culprits that have been called out are, first and foremost, data sprawl, which can also be contributed to tool sprawl, or having too many agents or too many components trying to pull data in. False alerts tends to be a big thing. That goes with the world of like, hey, we need an AI ops solution. Tends to be a big question a lot of people have. And then lastly, not understanding system dependencies. So That's actually one that comes up. I know it's only 41% here, but I would say more often than not, that tends to be people say, yeah, we actually don't know where it's happening, and it's very hard to understand in a sea of 200 services where the actual problem is, even let alone do we have that documented, which is also a big contributing factor why people are looking at observability solutions to get a out-of-the-box view. So the general guidance and the general feedback from organizations that feel like they're doing observability better, and I've got some stats on the next page in terms of what that means, is to start connecting your tools. Most organizations have between 15 and 30 observability tools. Many of them, like Splunk and others, can sort of serve as like a starting point as a send all your data in, and then eventually you can move towards more of a platform observability approach where they have out-of-the-box observability for specific use cases. And the benefits reported from, and this is actually coming from a separate survey that Oxford had done, but the main highlight is that organizations that say that they are like sort of doing best-of-breed observability are 8x more likely to report positive ROI. And I was reading an article recently, it was on Medium, and it was about the challenge of being, a system engineer, an SRE team. How do you sell to your management the merits of observability? Because that's a lot of times we see as part of the roadblock, especially when if you're using a lot of different tools and you'd like to consolidate or start to move towards something like OpenTelemetry and really consolidate your pipeline, your data, it's a challenge. Like, how do you actually sell that up the chain? So I don't go into much guidance here on it, but there's a really cool, is on Medium, there's a Medium article that basically had a couple example slides talking through the actual ROI and looking at everything from like how long it takes to detect, how many people are involved, and then also being able to tie back like rates of change and developer velocity in terms of actual output and revenue and whatnot. And while the feedback is and the guidance is like, hey, consolidate, bring your data in, it is hard. It's really hard, and I'd say that's probably the biggest issue right now is that we find, especially the larger financials. Like it's like how, we were talking before the meeting. It's like how do you actually turn the ship? How do you move forward? I personally have seen across all my engagements, I've seen two things work, and maybe they're pretty obvious, but they're either one, it's a, hey, rip the Band-Aid and we're going full bore, we're taking 12 to 18 months, we're gonna do a whole replumbing, we're gonna do what we need to do to get into a good place. I've personally worked with 4 accounts that have done that, and a lot of times they use Splunk and other tools because the beauty of OpenTelemetry is you can send the data to multiple destinations. The most interesting thing is like, we've got a customer that's, it's a 150-year-old customer, and they've got everything old and in between, mainframe, this and that, and they would attest that they're about 80 to 90% covered by using the OpenTelemetry collector and all the things that come with OpenTelemetry. For them, it was partly philosophical too. It's like they believe that in order to do observability right, like you shouldn't have vendors, agents, and libraries in your systems. A big value of observability comes from when you have, as we were talking about before the meeting, when you have developer teams that actually get bought in and start to paint their, OpenTelemetry is a standard to begin with, but if you have, like from there, if you make different practices around actually which metadata you use or which tags you use or what sort of propagation or what sort of naming conventions you use beyond, you can get a lot more value out of your observability solution, even as simple as something to be able to see traces surf across all your systems so you can quickly pinpoint where a problem is. And that's really just not something that people tend to do when they use proprietary agents or libraries, right? Because you're locked into it. And I kind of, I realize I kind of already gave the spiel as I was going through the slides, but again, things are really complex, your systems are big, you have a lot going on today, everyone's moving to the cloud, and although I see some reports that people are going backwards to the data centers, and AI in the data center is going to be a big thing. Data volumes or digital exhaust is exploding, and this actually is a key piece because typically we'll hear customers say like, oh, we're going to OTel because we want to save money. And that's 100% true, but it's not just OTel that saves you, OpenTelemetry that saves you money. It's a piece of it, and then there's also a lot that the vendors are doing to help contribute to making sure that, even though Splunk is one of the vendors that's gotten a bad rap for pricing over years, in our case, we've updated pricing, but we've also updated mechanisms for how, when you send the data in, giving you the right controls around that. And then we're not the only ones, like pretty much all the platform vendors, I'm not supposed to name any names, but a number of the other vendors are all doing the same thing where if you leverage something like OpenTelemetry and you're passing the data, and you can also leverage our pipeline and data governance capabilities to save money. And I've already kind of hit on this too. Like, so the reality is this is what most enterprises, when we talk to them, and most financial services are like very egregious around this. It's just a lot of tools, right? It's a lot that you're dealing with. And I would go back to that original cost times, downtime slide where it shows where that stat around, it's human error. And I would say this is what I've seen be the big culprit. It's just that there's just too many tools. There's too much that people are having to deal with. And some people call it, there's too much context switching or swivel chairing, but it just doesn't allow for effective observability. And as I already mentioned too, and Splunk's been in this game for a while where, or like tools like Elastic, I know I'm not supposed to say names, but they're the ones I see doing this well, where they can start to suck your data in from wherever. It doesn't matter who's collecting or what's grabbing it. You can at least have a starting point of consolidated observability and then modernize with the vendor as you go along. But the reality is, OpenTelemetry, I would say, is a big driver in what's actually allowing people to move the needle in regards to how do we go from a lack of standards to multiple logging libraries to multiple tools to no single pane of glass, or as one CTO told me, don't tell me you give me a single pane of glass because I've got 50 single panes of glasses. And we said, what are you trying to do? So I'd like to understand when problems are occurring, where they're occurring, and what's happening, right? And so I think that's where I do believe that, and as we're still somewhat early days in the world of OpenTelemetry, being 4 years into the project. But I would say what I've seen, as I mentioned earlier, even in the last 2 years, the coverage that OpenTelemetry has gotten in terms of what it can grab data from and what it can work on is vastly improved. And we had a customer one time that was telling us that they didn't think that OpenTelemetry would work on a certain part of a certain Java version, and their teams were actually in the process of instrumenting OpenTelemetry. And it's just those disconnects. It's like sad to see, but we just want to make sure that everyone realizes like this is, all right, it's here and it's ready. And if nothing else by the numbers, right, these are the number of commits from straight off the GitHub page. It's continuing on the upswing, and then the bottom part is just actually extrapolating what that actually looks like. A favorite of mine, so as a former Gartner employee, anytime I can use Gartner research, I will. Even though to some extent showing the OpenTelemetry, like hitting the peak of expectations, somewhat says, well, okay, yeah, it's still inflated. The reality is, though, I would suspect that it's still out there and getting deployed way more than what you might expect in terms of coming down from the peak. It's not like it's going to just not get deployed. But I think there's certainly some merit to there's a peak of expectations, but that doesn't change the fact that it's getting deployed and folks are starting to use it and what they can expect from it. And I thought it was an interesting call out. So Gartner, in their research, and I'm still friends with some of the Gartner analysts that are over there. We have some former Gartner analysts at Splunk. I was not an analyst, by the way. I was always in the sales and business development side, but some people thought I was an analyst. And at Splunk, sometimes people introduce me as an analyst. I'm like, no, not, but that's cool. But they, as they're calling out in the most recent hype cycle, and also they called this out in the Magic Quadrant for observability, that they're seeing a big shift towards companies are going OpenTelemetry, and then combine that with, as I've already kind of talked about, the tooling that vendors have and offer from a full sort of pipeline perspective to be able to give you full control. I don't know if I need to go through this slide, because I think everyone mentioned they are familiar with OpenTelemetry, but just as a precaution, it is, generally speaking, it's a set of SDKs and libraries that you can use to grab data from your applications. And what is it really? It just captures metric data, trace data, and logging data. Logging data thing is key because it did go GA last year, and we were seeing, we were on with a large financial the other day where their platform team, actually someone on the security side, and he said, we just got a request in from 2 of our largest applications that they're now going to be sending us all this OpenTelemetry data, and it's OpenTelemetry logs to begin with, which is interesting because OpenTelemetry, as many may know, started off with the tracing specification, and then logs and metrics were added over the last 2 years. In terms of what OpenTelemetry looks like from a actual architecture component perspective, so if 5 years ago, if I were working for a proprietary APM vendor, I might come in here and show you a slide like this, and it would say something like a one agent or something in the middle, or maybe another vendor's agent. But it really has, it's a complete system basically to be able to allow you to grab data from all your applications, your infrastructure. And as I mentioned at the top, so a lot of times people say, oh, it's only for cloud native. again, we are seeing more and more customers that actually, like some of our larger financials, where they actually start with legacy infrastructure. We have a customer that's working with us on mainframe observability, and that's something that's actually becoming very popular as everyone's gotten on board with that part of the project. And ultimately, OpenTelemetry is all about right data for the right use case. So we've seen a lot of customers, and I think this is partly because we're coming from the world of Splunk, which has traditionally been a logging vendor. A lot of our customers are looking to how do we actually take the 40% of our logs that shouldn't be logs. And there's two ways you can do that, right? You can go and try to use pipeline capabilities to do it, but also there's ways to now start to just leverage OpenTelemetry natively, start to expose metrics and swap over time. But ultimately, it is about cost savings and the right data for right use cases, because logs should not be used really beyond tracing a small number of services. They're really expensive to process across a large set of services. We've got a large financial out in Connecticut that they built out an entire tracing stack on logging, and it's very expensive to run that consistently. Now, can you swap to OpenTelemetry overnight? We were talking before. No, it is somewhat a process, especially if it's deeply embedded into your systems. But they finally see sort of a path forward to how can we move towards an actual modern approach. And it wasn't until they felt like OpenTelemetry was actually starting to be ready that they thought they could start to go in that direction. And then a little bit piece on metrics too, because metrics are interesting because metrics can be queried from logs, they can be queried from traces, or they can be instrumented discretely as their own metrics or infrastructure metrics. I'm not going to go too deep into the weeds on this, but something that's fun is that if you have traces, and I had a customer do this one time where they were showing me all their metric dashboards and next to their logs, and they had instrumented traces pretty well. And basically, you can derive the same insights by querying both sets of data. And then it becomes a question of like, okay, which is cheaper to process? And can you, by querying the trace data for the metrics, can you also then just use that as like, hey, that's our problem detection and our metric engine? It's still early days on like whether or not that becomes, how much of a practice it becomes, or do people just use what it comes out of the box and that's it, and what the vendors offer, but interesting nonetheless. I've mentioned a lot about so OpenTelemetry itself is like a pipeline. It's a set of pipelines. You can see it as that. But there's not a whole, like you have to build in additional processing, or there's the, for anyone's seen what Netflix does, they do a whole lot of things where it's like variable dynamic sampling and this and that. It's pretty crazy, but nobody has that sort of engineering expertise, or most don't have that sort of engineering expertise or want to stay on top of it. Most vendors now in the space, if they're a platform vendor that offers holistic observability, most are now to the point where whether it's metric data, trace data, log data, you can leverage OpenTelemetry as the collection mechanism. We can also take data that's not OpenTelemetry and convert it. You can either pass it through the OTel collector or use some of the vendor capabilities to be able to transform the data in ways to make observability more cost effective, frankly, because I feel like that's really where we're sort of at as a space, is customers feel like they want to get what they can get from observability, but do so cost effectively. And this is, I would say, within observability is probably the one of the, I would argue is going to be a focal point over the next year or two or three, where a lot of customers are going to start wanting to go. So in conjunction with OpenTelemetry as being able to set them up for cost-effective observability. And then I mentioned a little bit about the idea of platform. So something I'll say on this. So we see a lot of customers, again, this might be because we're from Splunk and I'm from Splunk and we have a lot of logging, a lot of customers that do things, they just log everything and want to query it and build this or that. So part of the beauty of moving towards an approach with OpenTelemetry where, and especially across each specification, is because of the structure of the data, vendors now and solutions can be built dynamically to query the data and on a variable basis. So take like trace data, for instance. You might have a trace that's coming in and it's got 30 services and so 30 like logs that are traced together. You may all of a sudden push out a bunch of services. A lot of times you'd have to go then rebuild your sort of, you'd have to add that into your service map or add that into what you observe. The nice thing is that OpenTelemetry, just because of the specification, we can write that dynamic query that knows that, oh, if 5 more pop up, it knows how to like process the data and put it into a view that you can then move more towards like AI-based detections and things like that, again, because we're not worried about the actual, like, the data variability. That's not to say that there's not still a world where, like, and this again, it's going to be a journey. I've just happen to been fortunate to see some of our customers, early adopters, go full bore on this thing, but there's still a world where you're going to want, like, to be able to just, no matter what data type it is, be able to quickly run a query and be able to see across any data sets, and that's still possible, but it's worth calling out that a big difference of what an observability platform is trying to do is the out-of-the-box nature that we're trying to drive. And I mention that because I was on a call one time, and the customer was like, and again, they were used to the way Splunk does things, and they said, okay, but so what queries do I have to build? And we're like, no, this is all just happening because of the data behind the scenes, and that's when I realized, okay, we're still sort of early days in this journey, not only on the Splunk side, but OpenTelemetry in general. And as I mentioned, kind of building on that, so an observability platform is really the value prop that's going to do the work for you, but you're leveraging OpenTelemetry. And that's certainly been the way that Splunk has approached it, that even a lot of people don't realize that you're leveraging OpenTelemetry, so you're sort of abstracting away from us, but the beauty of the data is that we can do a lot more out-of-the-box AI stuff, better detection, to ultimately drive back to the original stats we saw around the cost of downtime. And then a quick slide. So this is actually put together by a customer. And this customer would tell you it doesn't matter what vendor you use. This is a sort of a vendor-agnostic slide, that the benefits and value of consolidating. And this is like the most egregious example of like consolidating to one solution. But and it was put together with actually one of our former Gartner analysts that's at Splunk, but it was based on numbers that Gartner has and that the customer agreed with. For every tool that you have in an environment, there's a 20% overhead. And if you multiply that out by tool, you can actually, there's like a factor you can multiply that above and beyond. But just alone on consolidating tooling, you're taking that 20% across the board of cost savings. And then they find that everything from capability coverage, which is kind of obvious, you're going to get coverage in everything, but time to detect can be reduced by 15 to 70%, because there are some stats where it shows it could be that low depending on what it's looking at. And then everything, efficiency, time to detect. And I would say my favorite thing and what I've seen or what customers report is that the actual like mental overhead of having to perform the job of SRE and operations and DevOps type roles, and especially going all the way up to the CTO. The CTO once was like, I don't care, I just want to know like when the problem's happening, where it is. Right? And that's the end of the ultimate goal, and like that can happen as you start to consolidate solutions into a single place. Here's a leave behind for the report. So if you can go on and you download the PowerPoint, you'll see you can click on that to get the full cost of downtime report. And then in terms of actionable next steps, so the customers I've seen that have actually made progress and again have gone full bore OpenTelemetry, they use workshops. And a lot of times we've seen they will have workshops across all their different development teams, their operations teams, hands-on workshops, not necessarily POCs, because, and this is where I think this is interesting, again, because I've seen customers actually do this, where when you have, I was on a call, we were on this workshop, and one of the heads of development was like, wait a minute, so you're telling me that I can get that, but I don't have to install your agent? Like I can use this open source thing, and the documentation's online, and I've got buddies who have contributed to it? He's like, okay, we're good. Let's do workshops to make sure we understand what your solution can offer and deliver for us. So I've got up here, I've got Splunk's got workshops, Honeycomb's got workshops. There's a bunch of others here that folks that have representatives here as well that do workshops. And to me, they're way easier and better. And I still see a lot of people still knee-jerk to like, hey, we need to do a POC. Workshops are really cool, especially because there's all the OpenTelemetry. There's dummy apps that you can use that are like pre-baked, ready to go for OpenTelemetry instrumentation. And then lastly, some good books to look out for. So my favorite is the Observability Engineering book. It's written by the folks at Honeycomb. It's a really, really, really good book. This one, the Cloud Native and OpenTelemetry, also written by Alex, was at Lightstep. And then lastly, we've got one of our Splunk engineers is releasing this Mastering OpenTelemetry book. It's actually coming out, I think, in a month. But if you're serious about it, or if you're looking to champion this within your organization, or you just want to know more, there's some really good books available out there. And the Honeycomb one they actually host on their website, so you can just Google it, and it's on their website as a PDF. And that's it. So thank you. How do you do in time? Okay, yeah, about 20 minutes. So if there's any questions, feel free to ask. Otherwise, I do see people rolling in, so I'm not sure if those are folks coming in for the next session. Yeah, there are folks here who can speak way, actually are helping build the different projects. So there's an effort to have them sort of, as I see it, like being merged, because I think Prometheus was starting to adopt the OpenMetric format, and OpenTelemetry is subscribing to it. It's not quite there yet where it's going to be merged. I think it's and I don't want to make too much of a comment again, because I'm not like tightly involved in the actual project itself. But I sort of see like one way or the other, they have to come together, because otherwise we'll end up with a, what do you call it, where we have two different audio specs on TVs. I don't see that happening, because in my opinion, I look and there's enough engineers working on both sides of the house and the projects. And I've seen a lot of companies that are using Prometheus are going OpenTelemetry, and so it'll naturally happen. And I think especially too, if you look at what we've seen be successful in the world of observability has been like, if a vendor can produce an agent that can get all your data and give you good out-of-the-box content, there's a market for what people will buy. Like there's a market where people buy that. Ideally, that's not the way. And so I sort of look at that as OpenTelemetry represents what people wanted in a proprietary APM that only somebody would buy, but in a fully open source way. So it's like, Joe Nikwal, who's a former APM analyst from Gartner I worked with, he likes to say, it's just, OpenTelemetry is just basically your modern one agent. And for anyone who knows, one agent from Dynatrace. So, and they're doing a lot of work on OpenTelemetry as well. So it's, yeah.